What would you do if you encountered the person you once loved, now alone, vulnerable, and in need of your help? The city pulsed with the frantic energy of rush hour, its streets glowing with streaks of red and white as traffic inched forward. Ethan Harper sat behind the wheel of his sleek black luxury car, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel. His phone buzzed incessantly on the dashboard, messages from clients, updates from his assistant, endless reminders of tasks awaiting his attention. He exhaled sharply, glancing at his watch. Another meeting, another deal, another relentless race against time. This was his life now. Constant motion, no room to slow down. He rubbed his temples, trying to drown out the symphony of honking, horns, and impatient drivers surrounding him. Just as he reached for his phone, something across the street caught his eye. A woman, struggling with her grocery bags. One slipped from her grasp, sending fruit and cans rolling onto the pavement. She bent down to retrieve them, her movements sluggish, almost strained. Then she wobbled slightly, a hand instinctively cradling her belly. Ethan froze. His pulse skipped. Even with her weary expression and softened features, there was no mistaking her. Lila. The city's noise seemed to blur into the background as the moment stretched, pulling him back to a time that felt like a lifetime ago. It had been months since he last saw her, and yet here she was, standing alone in the middle of a crowded street, visibly pregnant, struggling to gather her scattered groceries. Ethan Harper had built a life most people only dreamed of. A self-made millionaire with an empire that spanned industries. People admired his ambition, his tenacity, his relentless pursuit of success. He was the man who always won, the man who never stopped moving. But beneath the polished veneer of triumph, there was an emptiness that clung to him like an unwelcome shadow. He had a gift for reading people, for knowing exactly what to say to turn the odds in his favor. His meetings were legendary, some even claimed he had a sixth sense for business. But no one saw what came after. The quiet, solitary drives home. The cold dinners eaten at a table far too large for one. At night, when the city settled and his phone finally fell silent, he would roam his sprawling mansion. The echo of his own footsteps a stark reminder of just how empty it was. His home was filled with everything wealth could buy. Exquisite art, designer furniture, the latest technology, but none of it could mask the hollowness. He had spent years chasing his empire, but somewhere along the way he had lost something invaluable. Or perhaps he had simply refused to acknowledge what it was. When he let himself linger in the stillness for too long, his mind would wander, back to a time when life had been different. Warmer, fuller, less lonely. He could still picture her face as if it were etched into his memory. Lila. She had been there from the very start, when his dreams were just fragile hopes scribbled on the backs of napkins. They had lived in a tiny apartment that smelled faintly of fresh paint and takeout from the restaurant downstairs. The furniture was mismatched, the heater barely worked in winter, and there were nights when the fridge was so empty it was painful to look at. But none of that had mattered. They had each other, and back then that had been enough. Ethan, she would say, her voice soft but unwavering on the nights he came home frustrated from yet another rejection. You're gonna make it, I know you will. You just have to keep going. She had believed in him even when he struggled to believe in himself. She had stayed up with him through endless nights of brainstorming business plans, crunching numbers, trying to find a way forward. She had been his anchor, his greatest champion, the one who laughed at his terrible jokes and celebrated the smallest victories as if they had won the lottery. And now, here she was, alone, struggling and pregnant. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. For the first time in a long time, time itself seemed to stop. There was one night that would always stay with him, no matter how many years passed. He had come home late, drained from a grueling meeting, his shoulders slumped under the weight of disappointment. Dropping onto the couch, he buried his face in his hands. "It's over, Lila," he murmured. "They turned me down again. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." She sat beside him, gently pulling his hands away and holding them in hers. "It's not over, Ethan," she said with quiet conviction. "You've faced worse. You'll get up tomorrow. You'll try again. And you'll succeed." Because you always do. When he looked at her then, really looked at her, the crushing weight on his chest lifted just a little. She had always been his anchor, the steady force in a world that never quite stopped shifting beneath him. But things changed. As Ethan's career gained momentum, so did the demands on his time. First, it was just a few late nights. Coming home long after Lila had gone to bed, whispering an apology, pressing a kiss to her forehead, and promising to make it up to her. And she believed him. She always believed him. That's what love was, wasn't it? Trusting even when it hurt. But the late nights became the norm. The murmured apologies turned into rushed justifications. And the promises, so full of hope and good intentions, never seemed to materialize. Ethan was always busy, always reaching for the next deal, the next big break. And Lila, ever patient, ever understanding, found herself slipping further into the background. She never voiced it outright, but the loneliness crept in regardless. It filled the empty spaces, the quiet evenings where she set the table for two but dined alone, the mornings where she reached for him only to find his side of the bed cold, and the weekends, the ones that had once been theirs, gradually disappeared into a blur of networking events and endless phone calls. She told herself it was temporary, that this was just the cost of building a future together. But some nights, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering when temporary would end. And other nights, the ache in her chest grew so heavy, so suffocating, she could barely breathe. She didn't want to resent him. She knew how hard he was working, not just for himself, but for both of them. So she swallowed her own worries, made space for his dreams, and kept going. But sometimes, in the mirror's reflection, she barely recognized herself. It didn't help that Ethan's world felt further and further removed from hers. As his success grew, so did his circle. Colleagues, clients, and business partners who moved effortlessly through high-end dinners and elite gatherings. Lila stood beside him, smiling, making conversation, but always feeling like an outsider. These were his people, not hers. She could tell by the way they spoke to her. Polite but distant, as though she were merely an extension of Ethan rather than his equal. One evening, after yet another event where she had spent more time with the waitstaff than the guests, she finally voiced what had been weighing on her heart. "Ethan," she said as they stepped inside their home, "do you ever feel like we're living in two different worlds?" He looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" he asked, loosening his tie as he headed for the kitchen. She followed, hesitating before speaking again. "At these events, I feel like I'm just there. Like I'm a guest in your life." Ethan frowned, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. "That's not true," he said, almost dismissively. "You're not a guest, Lila. You're my partner." "Am I?" she asked softly, and the silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm. He turned to her then, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Of course you are. I wouldn't be here without you." She wanted to believe him. She really did. But the words felt practiced, more reflex than sincerity. And though she longed to tell him how alone she had been feeling, how much distance had settled between them, she was too exhausted to fight for a conversation that might lead nowhere. So, she let it go. With a quiet nod, she turned and headed for bed, leaving him behind, buried in his emails, in his spreadsheets, in a world that no longer felt like it belonged to both of them. But things didn't improve. If anything, they unraveled further. Lila stopped attending events, stopped waiting up for him at night. She threw herself into hobbies, into friendships, into anything that might distract her from the growing chasm between them. But no matter what she did, the loneliness remained, burrowing deeper, settling into a space inside her that she could no longer ignore. The breaking point arrived on a quiet Saturday morning. Ethan was in his office, lost in stacks of contracts, while Lila sat motionless on the couch, staring at the packed suitcase beside the door. She had been sitting there for what felt like hours, her heart hammering as she silently rehearsed the words she knew she had to say. When she finally stood and made her way to his office, her legs felt unsteady, as though they might give out beneath her. She knocked softly on the doorframe. Ethan glanced up, distracted. Hey, he said, gesturing for her to wait. Can this hold off? I'm in the middle of something. No, she replied, her voice trembling. Can't. He frowned, setting down his pen, giving her his full attention for the first time in what felt like weeks. What's wrong? She took a deep breath, her hands clenched at her sides. I can't do this anymore, Ethan. His eyes widened, the words landing like a blow. What do you mean? Can't do what? This, she said, motioning vaguely, at the room, at him, at everything between them. I feel like I'm disappearing. Like I'm just waiting for you to see me. And I can't keep living like this. Lila, he started, but she shook her head, cutting him off. I love you, she said, her voice cracking. I always have, but I can't keep sacrificing myself for something that doesn't even feel like it belongs to us anymore. You're building this life, Ethan, but I don't see myself in it. He stood, reaching for her, but she took a step back. Wait, he pleaded, desperation creeping into his tone. We can fix this. I'll do better. It's too late, she whispered, tears slipping down her face. I've been trying, Ethan, for so long and I can't anymore. Before he could say another word, she turned and walked out, her suitcase in hand. The soft click of the door closing behind her echoed through the house, leaving behind a silence that was deeper, emptier than anything Ethan had ever felt before. And just like that, she was gone. He didn't realize he was holding his breath until the sharp honk of a car behind him pulled him back. Ethan blinked, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. For a moment, he hesitated. Should he get out? Should he say something? But then he saw Lila stumble. At first, it was just a slight misstep, her hand reaching out instinctively for support where there was none. Then, almost in slow motion, she collapsed. Her knees hit the pavement, groceries spilling onto the street, rolling away in every direction. Ethan didn't think. He just moved. He stepped out of the car, his feet hitting the pavement. Though he wasn't sure what he was going to say, all he knew was that he couldn't drive away. Not this time. The air felt heavy. Every sound around him muffled as he took an unsteady step forward. Then another. Lila, he called, his voice barely above a whisper, as if saying her name too loudly might shatter the fragile reality before him. She lifted her head slightly, their eyes meeting, and for a moment, a fleeting, breathless moment, the years between them collapsed. But then her expression shifted. Confusion, then recognition, and finally something unreadable. Was it fear? Shame? He couldn't tell. He didn't have time to figure it out. Her body wavered again, the last of her strength slipping away, and before he could think, he was moving. Lila! His voice cracked, louder this time, edged with panic. He reached her just as she started to collapse, his arms catching her trembling frame. She felt lighter than he remembered, her body limp against his, her breath shallow. His heart pounded as he carefully lowered her to the ground, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Lila, can you hear me? Ethan, I'm right here. Her lips parted, a faint sound slipping out, but it was too soft to understand. Her eyelids fluttered weakly, and for a second, he thought she might say something. But then, they shut completely, her body growing heavier in his arms. No, he muttered, shaking her gently. Stay with me, Lila. Please. She stirred, her head lolling against his chest. Ethan? She breathed, so quiet he almost didn't hear it. I'm okay. You're not okay. He shot back, though the desperation in his voice outweighed any frustration. You just collapsed in the middle of the street. Lila, what's going on? What's wrong? Her fingers twitched weakly, drifting toward her stomach. That's when he noticed it. The way her other hand cradled her abdomen, instinctive and protective. His breath hitched, his chest tightening as the realization crashed over him. She was pregnant. Is it the baby? He asked urgently, leaning closer. Is something wrong? Lila, talk to me. No, she murmured, her voice barely there. Just tired. He echoed, disbelief threading through the word. Lila, you collapsed. That's not just being tired. He cut himself off, exhaling sharply. Now wasn't the time to argue. Not when she looked like she might lose consciousness at any second. He needed to act. "All right," he said firmly, as much to himself as to her. "We're going to the hospital. Right now." "No," she protested, her fingers weakly clutching his sleeve. "I don't need to." "Lila, stop," he interrupted, his tone both soft and unwavering. "You can explain everything later, but right now this isn't up for debate. We're going." Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came out. Instead, her grip slackened, her hand falling limply to her side. Ethan didn't hesitate. He carefully scooped her up, cradling her against his chest as he rose to his feet. She felt so small, so fragile, and the realization twisted something deep inside him. "Just hold on," he murmured, voice quieter now. "I've got you." He moved quickly, weaving through the crowded sidewalk as people barely spared them a second glance. The noise of the city faded, drowned out by the singular focus pounding through his mind, getting her to safety. At his car, he managed to open the passenger door one-handed, easing her gently into the seat. He adjusted her carefully, making sure she was as comfortable as possible before shutting the door and hurrying to the driver's side. Sliding in, he stole a glance at her as he started the engine. Her eyes were closed, her hands still resting over her stomach. She looked so vulnerable, so different from the Lila he once knew, the woman who had stood beside him with quiet strength and unwavering determination. Now, she looked like she was barely holding on. Ethan's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white as he pulled into traffic. The drive to the hospital felt endless, every red light stretching time unbearably. His thoughts raced, a storm of worry, guilt, and questions. How had it come to this? How had she ended up like this? And why hadn't she told him? His gaze flickered toward her again, his chest clenching as he watched the slow, steady rise and fall of her breathing. Each breath reassured him, but also reminded him of just how fragile she seemed. "Just stay with me," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to her or himself. By the time they pulled up to the hospital, Ethan barely took the time to park, leaving the car crooked near the entrance without a second thought. Ignoring the curious stares, he jumped out and hurried to the passenger side, flinging the door open. He leaned in, his fingers brushing against her cool cheek. "Lila, we're here," he murmured. "Can you hear me?" Without a moment's hesitation, he gathered her into his arms, holding her tightly as he strode toward the hospital doors. The blast of cool air inside barely registered as he stepped through, his entire focus on the unmoving woman in his arms. Around him, nurses turned, their expressions shifting to alarm as they took in the scene. "She collapsed," Ethan said urgently. "She's pregnant. Please help her." The staff sprang into motion, one of them wheeling over a chair. "Set her down here," a nurse instructed. Ethan hesitated, reluctant to let her go, but finally, he nodded and carefully lowered her into the seat. She stirred slightly, her head tilting to the side as they began to wheel her away. "Can I? Should I?" Ethan started, but a nurse cut him off. "Wait in the lobby, we'll update you as soon as we can." So he paced, his footsteps echoing against the linoleum, his thoughts tangled in worry. Every few minutes, his gaze flicked to the double doors she had disappeared behind, silently pleading for someone to walk through and tell him she was all right. The minutes dragged, stretching unbearably long. Finally, a doctor emerged, his calm demeanor doing little to soothe the knot of fear in Ethan's chest. "How is she? Is she?" His voice faltered. "Is the baby?" "She's stable," the doctor assured him. "The baby is too, but she's severely malnourished and exhausted. We're giving her fluids and monitoring her condition. She needs rest and proper care, but for now she's okay." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, relief washing over him. "Thank you. Can I see her?" The doctor nodded. "She's sleeping, but you can sit with her. Just keep it quiet. She needs rest more than anything." Ethan followed him down the hall, his heart pounding with every step. When they reached the room, he hesitated at the doorway, his fingers tightening around the frame. Lila lay still on the bed, her face pale, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. She looked so small, so fragile, and guilt hit him like a punch to the gut. He stepped inside, pulling a chair close before sinking into it. For a while, he just watched her breathe, trying to find the right words, but nothing came. Outside, hushed voices drifted in from the hallway. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the words froze him in place. "She doesn't have insurance that covers this," a nurse murmured. "Her bills are months overdue. I don't know how she's been managing." "I heard she's been living out of her car," another voice replied, "and she's pregnant. It's a miracle she even made it here." Ethan's stomach twisted. Living in her car, overdue bills. He turned back to Lila, his chest tightening. How had things gotten this bad? How had she ended up here, alone, struggling, barely surviving? His jaw tensed as he pushed himself to his feet, the chair scraping against the floor. Moving to the bedside, his hands curled into fists at his sides. "Lila, how did it come to this?" His voice was quiet, but thick with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her eyelids fluttered, her gaze unfocused as she turned slightly. Then she looked away, staring out the window. "Because I couldn't," she whispered. "Not to me? Not to you," she repeated. He took a step closer. "Lila, you've been living out of your car. You're pregnant. Why didn't you say something?" Her fingers tightened slightly over her stomach as she exhaled shakily. "Because I didn't think you'd care, Ethan," she said, her voice laced with something he couldn't quite decipher. "Not after everything." Her words hit harder than he expected. "Lila?" His voice cracked with guilt. "That's not true, isn't it?" she asked, finally meeting his gaze. Her expression was unreadable, exhaustion deep in her eyes. "You barely noticed me back then. Why would this be any different?" He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. She wasn't wrong. He had failed her before, and now that failure sat heavy on his chest. Lila sighed, her eyes drifting toward the ceiling. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she murmured. "I left because I thought I could start over. I thought I could build a better life." "What happened?" Ethan asked gently, leaning in. She paused for a long moment before speaking again. "I gave my savings to my cousin Mia. She promised to repay me, but then she lost her job. Then I got downsized. I couldn't keep up with the rent. I tried to make it work, but..." She shook her head, trailing off. "One thing after another, eventually, I couldn't afford the apartment anymore. I ended up living in my car. It broke down a few weeks ago." Ethan stared at her, his chest tightening with every word. "Why didn't you reach out to me?" he asked, his voice softer this time. "Because I didn't want to," she replied plainly, meeting his gaze. "I didn't want you to see me like this, Lila." But she shook her head, cutting him off. "I've been getting by, Ethan. Barely. But I've managed. I didn't need you swooping in to fix things. Not after everything that's happened." She had every right to feel that way. Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his hair as he absorbed everything she had said. For the first time in years, he saw the cracks in the life he had built. The places where he had failed. Not just her, but himself. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, after a long silence. "For everything." She didn't reply, her eyes drifting closed again as exhaustion took over. Ethan sat there, watching her breathe. And for the first time he felt the full weight of what he had lost. What he had let slip away. And in that moment, he realized just how much he wanted to make things right. Over the next few days, Ethan came to the hospital regularly to check on Lila. She seemed to be improving, her color returning, and her movements less sluggish. However, a quiet tension still lingered between them, an unspoken weight neither of them had addressed. A nurse entered, offering a warm smile as she helped Lila adjust her gown for the ultrasound. Ethan sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly, in his lap, trying to appear calm even though his chest felt like it might burst. Lila reclined on the examination table, her shirt lifted just enough to expose her rounded belly. The nurse applied cool gel to her skin, and the rhythmic swoosh of the baby's heartbeat filled the room. Ethan's breath caught at the sound. It was so steady, so real. He couldn't look away from the monitor, from the faint outline of the tiny life inside her. Felt surreal, like something out of a dream. He stayed silent, his eyes glued to the screen. The doctor entered, smiling cheerfully, clipboard in hand. "Ah, there's the little one," he remarked, glancing at the monitor, looking healthy and right on track. "Congratulations, Dad." Ethan's heart stopped for a moment. "What?" The word escaped him, sharper than he intended, slicing through the calm of the room. His gaze snapped to Lila, his eyes wide. The doctor, oblivious to the sudden tension, chuckled lightly. "I said congratulations. You've got a healthy baby in there." Ethan's mind was spinning as he turned back to Lila. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the ceiling, her lips pressed tight. Her silence was deafening. In that instant, he knew. "Lila, is it? Is the baby mine?" She didn't respond, but her eyes flickered. Just a brief, involuntary movement that confirmed everything. Ethan felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him, the air suddenly thicker, harder to breathe. His hands clenched the armrests as he tried to process the revelation. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was low, barely controlled. Hurt and anger swirled within him, maybe a little of both. "Why didn't you think I deserved to know?" Lila turned her head slightly, her expression guarded. "Because it wouldn't have made a difference," she said softly. "You barely noticed me back then, Ethan. Why would this be any different?" His heart clenched at her words, like they had struck a nerve he didn't even know was there. "That's not fair," he said, shaking his head. "You know that's not fair, isn't it?" She retorted, her voice sharp. She sat up slightly, wincing as she shifted. "You weren't there, Ethan. You weren't there when I needed you, when we were supposed to be building a life together. You were always too busy. Too busy for me. Too busy for anything that wasn't your work. And now you think you can just step in and fix everything?" Her words hit him like a wave, leaving him dizzy and unsure of how to respond. A storm of emotions churned inside him, and he struggled to find the right words. How could he make her understand that he wasn't the same person anymore? Or at least that he didn't want to be. "I let you go because I thought that's what you needed," he confessed. "I thought I wasn't enough for you. But now I realize I wasn't even there when you needed me the most. And I'm so sorry, Lila. I truly am." She held his gaze, her face softening just a little, though the tension in her posture remained. "It's not that simple, Ethan," she replied. "This isn't just about saying sorry. It's about responsibility, about showing up. And you can't just show up now and expect me to believe you've changed." "I'm not asking you to believe anything," he said quickly, his voice sincere. "I'm asking for a chance to prove it, to show that I want to be here. Not because I have to, but because I want to. For you and for the baby." Lila studied him for a long moment, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, as though looking for some sign that his words were real. Her voice cracked with raw emotion when she finally spoke. "I can't do this on my own," she whispered, her shoulders slumping, the weight of her vulnerability pulling her down. A quiet cry for help born of exhaustion, fear, and loneliness that had followed her through every night spent alone in her car. "You won't have to," he promised immediately, his voice firm. "I'm here, Lila. Whatever you need, I'm not going anywhere." She gave him a barely perceptible nod, enough to show she was listening. "Okay," she said, her voice worn and tired. "Okay." Ethan felt a strange sense of relief mixed with resolve. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something, a chance, a start. He could make things right not just for Lila, but for the life they had brought into the world. He wasn't going to let it slip away again. The following weeks were a blur of changes, most of them driven by Ethan. He didn't know where to begin, but one thing was clear. He couldn't let Lila face this alone, not when he had the means to help, not when he was determined to be the man she and their baby needed. His first priority was finding her a safe place to live. He spent countless hours on the phone with real estate agents, making sure they found an apartment in a quiet neighborhood near the hospital. When he finally took Lila to see it, her reaction surprised him. "It's too much, Ethan," she said, standing in the doorway with her hands protectively covering her belly. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," he insisted, stepping closer to her. Lila, you need somewhere comfortable. I'm not trying to fix everything in one go. I'm just trying to make things easier for you. For both of you. She looked at him for a long moment, hesitation in her eyes. Finally, she nodded. Okay, she said softly. Thank you. But Ethan didn't stop there. He covered the rent so she wouldn't have to worry about mounting bills. And though the grand gestures mattered, it was the little things that began to make a difference. Like trying to cook. It was a total disaster. He had watched a tutorial online, confident he could handle something simple like pasta. But the sauce burned, the noodles stuck together, and the kitchen smelled like smoke. Lila stood in the doorway, amusement in her eyes, as she watched him frantically wave a dish towel at the smoke detector. You know, she said, suppressing a laugh. There's this great thing called takeout. You might want to try it sometime. Ethan turned to her, cheeks flushed not only from the heat of the stove, but from embarrassment. I was trying to do something nice. He muttered, though his lips curved into a sheepish smile. She stepped closer, shaking her head. Well, I appreciate the effort, she said, taking the spoon from his hand. But maybe next time just stick to salad. They both laughed, the sound breaking the tension that had lingered between them for so long. He also made sure to go with her to every doctor's appointment, sitting beside her in the waiting room and asking questions during the checkups. Initially, Lila seemed taken aback by his interest, her eyebrows lifting in surprise when he asked about things like due dates and feeding schedules. But gradually, that surprise softened, transforming into something gentler, maybe gratitude or even trust. You don't have to come to every appointment, she said one afternoon as they left the clinic. She adjusted her coat, casting him a look that was part curiosity, part hesitation. Most guys would leave this to the moms. I'm not most guys, he replied simply, holding the door open for her. And this isn't just about you. It's about us figuring this out together. She didn't answer immediately, but the faint smile tugging at her lips spoke volumes. Their conversations began to flow more easily, the silences between them less awkward. Ethan found himself looking forward to their time together, even the quiet, everyday moments. He started spending more time at her apartment, bringing groceries, helping her organize the baby's things, just being present. Gradually, the walls Lila had built around herself started to come down. One evening, after dinner, takeout this time, they sat on the couch. Ethan glanced at her, his chest tight with a feeling he couldn't put into words. She was folding tiny onesies, her movements tender, as though each piece of clothing held a special meaning for her. Lila, he said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. She looked up, halting mid-fold. Yeah, he hesitated, his fingers tracing random patterns on the edge of the coffee table. There's something I need to tell you. Her brow furrowed slightly, and she set the onesie down. Okay, she said, her tone cautious. What is it? Ethan took a deep breath, his gaze dropping to the floor. I thought that if I became successful, if I built this life for us, it would make me worthy of you. I thought it would fix everything. But all it did was push you away. Lila's expression softened. She leaned back slightly, her hands folding neatly in her lap. Ethan, she said, her voice slightly shaky. I never needed you to be perfect. I didn't need the big house or the fancy job or any of that. I just needed you to try. Her voice broke, and her eyes shimmered with tears. That's all I ever wanted. His chest tightened, her words weighing on him like a heavy blanket. I'm trying now, he whispered. I know it's late, maybe too late. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. She stared at him for a long moment, the silence hanging between them. Slowly, she nodded. I know, she said softly. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. But it was enough. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And maybe, just maybe, they could move forward together. Then, in the middle of the night, the phone rang. Ethan had just drifted to sleep when his phone buzzed on the nightstand, its sharp ring cutting through the quiet. Groggy, he grabbed it, squinting at the screen. Lila's name appeared, and his heart skipped a beat before racing with anxiety. Lila, he answered, his voice tight. It's time, she said, her voice trembling. I think it's happening, Ethan.
I'm scared.
Stay put, he said, already out of bed and pulling on his shoes. I'm on my way. Just breathe. I'll be there in 10 minutes. The drive to her place felt endless. Each red light, every slow car, made his anxiety tighten further. By the time he reached her building, his hands were shaking on the steering wheel. He found her on the couch, pale and sweating, one hand on her belly, the other gripping the armrest. Ethan, she gasped as he rushed toward her. I think it's too soon. It's okay, he said, crouching beside her and taking her hand. We'll get through this. Let's get you to the hospital. He helped her to her feet, moving quickly but carefully. She winced with each step, her grip tightening on his arm as they made their way to the car. Once he helped her into the passenger seat, his hand lingered on her shoulder for a moment. We've got this, he said, though his heart was pounding in his chest. The hospital was a blur of urgent movements and soft voices. Nurses and doctors guided them through hallways and into a delivery room, their directions calm but quick. Ethan stayed close, holding her hand through each contraction. Her grip strong enough to make him wince, but he didn't mind. You're doing great, he whispered, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. Just a little longer. She shot him a look between breaths. Don't say just a little longer unless you're the one doing this. Ethan chuckled despite the tension in his voice. Fair point, he agreed, but you're still amazing. The hours dragged on in a blur of exhaustion and anxiety, each minute blending into the next. Then, at last, a sharp, piercing cry broke the silence, the first sound of their daughter's voice. Ethan's breath caught as the nurse handed the tiny squirming bundle to Lila. Her face softened in an instant, the exhaustion melting away as she gazed lovingly at the baby. Ethan stood there, overwhelmed by the rush of emotions, the joy, the deep, overwhelming love that tightened his chest and brought tears to his eyes. She's perfect, Lila whispered, tears falling as she touched her baby's tiny hand. Ethan leaned closer, his voice thick with emotion. Yeah, she really is. In that moment, everything else faded. The past, the mistakes, the time apart. All that mattered was the new life they'd created, and the silent vow to do better, to be better, for her. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and steep learning curves. With the same focus he once gave his work, Ethan devoured every parenting book he could find, peppered the nurses with questions, and watched endless videos on newborn care. His first attempt at swaddling the baby was a complete failure. The blanket bunched awkwardly and the baby wriggled free within seconds. How do they make this look so simple in the videos? He muttered, furrowing his brow and trying again. Lila, sipping tea nearby, burst out laughing. You're overthinking it, she teased, setting her cup down. Let me show you. She guided his hands, showing him how to fold the blanket correctly. When the baby was finally swaddled snugly, Ethan grinned with pride. Look at that, he said, glancing at Lila. We make a great team. Don't get cocky, she teased, though the warmth in her smile was unmistakable. They gradually found their rhythm, navigating the chaos of parenthood together. There were sleepless nights filled with feedings and diaper changes, quiet mornings where they shared yawns and laughs over cold coffee, and peaceful afternoons watching their daughter sleep soundly in her bassinet. One night, as Ethan rocked the baby back to sleep after a particularly fussy stretch, Lila appeared in the doorway. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, a gentle smile on her face. You're good at this, she said softly. Ethan looked up, surprised. I'm trying, he said quietly, not wanting to wake the baby. I still feel like I'm winging it half the time. Welcome to parenthood, Lila said with a soft laugh as she stepped into the room. She stood beside him, her gaze drifting to the baby in his arms. But seriously, Ethan, you're doing a great job. The sincerity in her voice made his heart ache. He looked at her, his expression tender. Thanks, he said. That means a lot. As time went on, the walls between them continued to crumble. They started taking walks in the park, pushing the stroller as they shared quiet moments watching their daughter laugh at the trees and passing dogs. They talked more about the baby, their dreams, and even the things they'd avoided for so long. One evening, As they sat on the couch with their daughter peacefully asleep in her crib, Ethan turned to Lila. He began, his voice unsure. I never thought I'd get a second chance with you, with all of this. Lila paused, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she smiled softly. You earned it, she said simply. It wasn't quite forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step forward. And as they sat there, the quiet warmth of the moment surrounding them, Ethan realized that this messy, imperfect, beautiful life was everything he'd ever wanted. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away.